So we're drawing to a close on the Sermon on the Mount. And to kind of set the historical situation here, we have to understand what's going on in the Jewish culture at the time. And at the time in the Jewish culture, there were two types of rabbis. Okay, there's a type of rabbis that were basically there to teach the children growing up the Jewish alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, and they were also there to teach the accepted interpretations of the law. But there is this other sort of Jewish rabbi that had what they called shmikah. And this type of rabbi had the authority to bring their own interpretation of God's law. And where that came from is back when Israel was first freed from Egypt, God gave them these laws to live by as a way for them to understand how to relate to Him. But then He told the leaders, Moses and Aaron, that you can't rule on your own, so appoint 70 different elders. And so this idea in Jewish culture became prevalent that there was this one law that God gave, but there could be 70 different interpretations of this law, of how to live that out. And what's interesting is only very few were considered to have the authority to be able to give a different interpretation. And so they would go around teaching in towns and they would say statements like, "You've heard it said, but I tell you." In other words, you've learned it this way, but here's my interpretation, or what they call their yoke. So when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we hear Jesus say that time and time again. You've heard it said, here was the thing that you've been taught your whole life, but I tell you. And so when He's giving this sermon, there's this huge crowd, and their understanding is this man has the authority to give his interpretation of what God really meant. But little did they know, or maybe some of them did sense it, that not only was he giving his own interpretation, he was actually giving the definitive interpretation, because after all, he was God Himself. And so what He's doing in the sermon is completely revolutionary to everybody there, but what He's actually speaking are the truths that God intended from the very beginning to be how His word and His law is interpreted. And so He started this sermon when we started way back defining blessedness. And He said, you're blessed if you're poor. You're blessed if you're meek. You're blessed if you're a peacemaker. And the crowd would have been, that makes no sense. And then as He progressed on His sermon, He started telling people, well, what does it look like if you live life with God in charge? Here's what it looks like when someone is of the kingdom, they say, which basically saying, here's what it looks like if someone is living as if God rules their lives. And here's what it looks like if somebody else is living as if God doesn't rule their lives. So how does He end the sermon? Greatest sermon ever told, right? How does he end this teaching? And what He does and where we find ourselves is He ends the sermon by giving 4 different contrasts of what it looks like if you're a kingdom God person and if you're not. Okay, so let's look through this. We're going to only focus on 3, or we're going to only read through 3, and then Pastor Alex will take the last one next week, okay? You there? You ready? It doesn't matter because we're going to keep going. Okay, Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their what? Fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good what? Fruits. But the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Right? So these are the first 3 contrasts. There's this contrast between the narrow gate and the wide gate. And then He draws this contrast between people that produce good fruit and bad fruit. And then he's drawing this contrast in the third one about people that God actually knows and people that only think they know God, but God is going to say, I never knew you, right? So there's that sort of situation. There's those three contrasts. And by giving those three contrasts, what Jesus is implying is, look, every single one of you have a choice. Are you going to be the narrow gate person or the wide gate person? Are you going to be the person who produces good fruit or bad fruit? Are you going to be the person that's going to come to the end of your life and I'm going to know you because you obeyed my Father? Or are you going to be the kind of person that comes to the end of your life and I'm going to say, who are you? It's a choice, right? It's very clear. There is no middle ground. You're going to choose to either be this or this. Which way are you going to live your life, right? That's the question that he's getting at. So let's think about the narrow gate and wide gate. Culturally, when Jesus talks about the wide gate, they would have pictured this. Can we show that picture? Okay. This is a modern day restoration of what a gate would have looked like back in those days. And what was happening is there was this Greek idea that was seeping into Jewish culture that said you can display your power and display your wealth by how great your gate looks when people enter your city. And so there's this idea that the moment you see a city gate and how it looks, you can make some quick judgments about, wow, that city is powerful, or that city is wealthy, or that city has a lot happening, it's very glamorous. Right? And so Jesus is saying, don't go to the gate that looks glamorous. Because if you're looking after wealth, if you're looking after fame, if you're looking after power, my kingdom's not about that. Because that's not going to satisfy you. We got to dig a little deeper. So what he's actually inviting people to do is, don't go after riches and power. My kingdom is different. My kingdom is hard. My kingdom is inviting you to live a difficult life, entering this narrow path and this narrow gate. My kingdom is not about this glamour. My kingdom is not about this worldly power. My kingdom is actually about humility. My kingdom is actually about brokenness. My kingdom is actually about being poor in spirit. Right? He's drawing a clear line. Don't go after the things that seem so appealing, because that's the wrong way. Instead, go this way. And then he talks about this idea of fruit, right? Good fruit and bad fruit. And he's specifically talking about prophets. Now, back in the days, how you would test if a prophet was legitimate was you would just wait and see if what they said came true. Okay? So prophecy, is one way to understand prophecy is someone stands up and makes some sort of declaration like, in this year, this is going to happen in Taiwan. And the people had no way to know if that prophet was actually legitimate or not, except for to wait and see if that prophecy came true. Do you see kind of a problem with that? So what Jesus is saying is, look, it's not about that. What you actually have to look at is not just whether what they say is true. You have to look at the fruit that their life is producing. Historically, this is probably in response to a group called the Zealots. Okay? And what was happening is the Zealots were this group that were very, zealous or excited about following God's laws. And so they would tell people, you got to follow God's laws and don't follow Caesar or whoever was in charge. Don't follow Rome. And it's a good message, right, to follow God. But the problem was, late at night, these zealots would carry these daggers hidden in their cloaks. And if they saw that you had worshipped Caesar, they would kill you. And they would do this all the time. Late at night, they would just walk around, hey, I saw this person worshiping Caesar. Right? Okay? And so what Jesus is saying is basically, in response to that, hey, look, their message sounds great. But their life really should reveal to you that they're not of my kingdom, because I wouldn't do it that way. Right? And so what he's saying is, I'm not interested in whether or not people say the right things. A lot of people could say the right things. I'm interested in what your life is producing. And then the third contrast, he's talking about basically people who do and people who do not do. We'll get to that later. But I want to focus primarily on the second contrast of fruit. And indirectly sort of that third contrast, right? And Jesus is saying, look, a person in my kingdom is distinguished not by what they say, but really by the fruit that comes out of their lives. And this, I think, goes back to a very fundamental question of this. How do you judge spiritual maturity? how do you judge whether a person is growing in God or whether a person is still immature in God? For your own lives. Or how do you judge looking at someone else whether they're spiritually mature? Or let me put it more simply. How would you answer this question? How are you doing with Jesus? It's a very Christianese question, right? What do you base that on? How do we measure our answer to the question of how are you doing with Jesus? Okay? Because I think we kind of quantify that by certain criteria, but we really should question, are those the right criteria? So how do you judge whether or not someone's spiritually mature or spiritually growing? From my background, which is charismatic, we valued giftedness a lot. And so to us, if a person is up here communicating the Word of God eloquently or with power, we think, man, that guy or that woman must be very, very mature spiritually. If we feel touched by the message, we think right away, oh my gosh, that guy has just got the Spirit of God flowing through him. Or if there's someone that leads worship, and every time they lead worship, you just cry like, oh, that touched my heart. And then we tended to equate that with, hey, that person must be doing well with God, because how else could God be using them so powerfully to impact my life? Spiritual giftedness, right? But we ignore the fact that the word there is it's a gift. It's not earned. It's not correlated with maturity. It's just God is using this person to bless the church. And so why do you think it is that a lot of the scandals in the church occur with some of the most gifted people? Because I would say giftedness is not how we should be measuring whether or not we're spiritually mature or not. Some of us would think, wow, involvement in church. If I'm involved in church, then I'm spiritually okay. Or, hey, that person that goes to church, they are at church 8 days a week. They are so holy. Oh my gosh, I want to be like them. Right? We feel like if I go on a mission trip, oh, I must be spiritually mature. And we make that judgment, right? Or maybe we equate it with how our devotional life goes. You know, where if we pray for 10 minutes, you know, and then, oh, that's pretty good. And then you hear, oh, man, this guy prays for an hour. He must be really mature. He is... What's the math? I'll go backwards. I'm 1/10 as mature as he is. I should pray for an hour. Or maybe we equate it with how well we know the Bible, you know, how well we've studied the Bible. And we think if we know the Bible well, then we're spiritually mature. I mean, ignoring the verses that say knowledge makes us arrogant, right? But love builds up, you know. And these criteria that we use are all necessary for growth, but Jesus never referred to those criteria to use to judge how our spiritual life is doing. Instead, what he says is what? You can tell how someone is doing spiritually if you look at their fruit that they produce in their lives. In other words, there's this idea that it's not about what's going on just on the outside, but it's actually what's coming out of them. Because what's inside you cannot stay hidden for too long. You know, if you're kind of like generally an angry person, you can put on that fake smile, but there's going to be moments where you just explode, right? I had this moment yesterday. We went to eat barbecue, and my kid was getting on this like little car ride, and then this other kid was like pushing him off. And I looked at the little kid, and in Chinese, I was like, you got to line up! And then he started crying. And I thought, that's right! That is the appropriate response for your sin against my son, you know? And my wife was like, wow, you really lost it. I was like, yeah. Where did that come from, you know? But it came out because guess what? It was in me, right? That was the fruit that my current state was producing, right? I hate kids. Okay. And so Jesus is saying, don't judge it on these other criteria, but really look at the fruit. Now, you know what the Greek word for fruit in the Bible, you should write this down. The Greek word for fruit means fruit. Don't write, okay, it gets good. But the figurative meaning is when it talks about fruit, it means everything done in partnership with Christ. So what Jesus is talking about, the good fruit, is what you do, not in your own strength, but in partnership with Christ. That's how the Bible understands the meaning of fruit. Okay, it's very clearly defined, some of the ways we can think about fruit in Galatians chapter 5. Verse 16, so this is Paul writing. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For those are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. Okay, like that kind of sums it up, right? I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Here it is. Here's the definition. But the fruit, what is the fruit we're talking about? This fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. That is what Jesus is saying. Don't evaluate yourselves on how long you pray or read the Bible. That doesn't really tell you how you're doing with me. Evaluate yourselves on, are you loving? Do you have joy? Do you have peace? Are you patient? Are you kind? Are you faithful? Etc., etc. Dallas Willard. Anyone know who Dallas Willard is? What? Okay, some of you know. Okay, so he's a professor of theology and philosophy, I believe, at University of Southern California, USC. And he wrote some very influential books. And they asked Dallas Willard, how can you tell how you're doing with God? How can you tell? He said, I asked myself 2 questions. And here's the questions he asked. Am I less easily irritated today than yesterday? And am I growing more or less easily discouraged? Now, you have to understand, this guy is PhD, okay, in spirituality. He has like a direct line to God, okay? And you would expect, when you say, how can you tell how you're doing with God, for him to say something really profound, like, does my heart break for the nations? Or, something like that. But what does he say? Am I less irritable, and am I less discouraged? Why? Because he understands that how he's doing with God is directly correlated to the evidence of the fruit that is coming out of his life. And so what I want us to do, just for a few moments, is, can we put up the next slide? I want you to just focus on these words, right? Love, faithfulness, kindness. And just to yourself, between you and God, right? You don't have to close your eyes. Just how are you doing? Are there areas where God is like, you're doing great in this area? Are there areas where God might want to point out to you, this might be an indication that there's something we need to work on? So just take 30 seconds to kind of focus and ask yourself how you're doing, right? Right? And so what Jesus is saying, hey, look, don't base how you're doing on your devotional life. Base it on your life. It's a lot more holistic, right? These are things that we encounter on a daily basis. These are things that show up in our lives on a daily basis. Okay? But in kind of closing, because I want to get home. Just kidding. In closing, just kidding. I want us to notice something when we're talking about this verse. It says it's the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of effort. Right? That's very important. It's the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of your effort. And the reason why I bring that up is there's a book called So You Don't Want to Go to Church Anymore. And it was written by this Christian author who used, anyone know the Barna Group? So they used a lot of statistics to look at the trends in the church. And when he asked around and he asked people, like, what do you think spiritual growth consists of? A majority of Americans, at least, said they believe that spiritual growth consists of trying really hard to follow the Bible. Trying really hard to follow the Bible, a human effort to follow what God has told you to do. And they said, I'm not growing because I just lack the motivation to grow. And I think we can all attest, for those of us that have tried living this way, that we just try by effort to follow the Bible, that you get easily discouraged when you fail, and you feel guilty. And it just becomes this slippery slope of you feel guiltier and guiltier, and so hence the title of the book, right? You don't want to go to church anymore. So it's not about our effort. It's not about the level of commitment, because if it's about our commitment and effort, pride is kind of lurking nearby that's going to help us to say, hey, I can do this on my own. Right, but Jesus plainly points out it's the fruit of the Spirit. You cannot just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be patient today. Try it. Or I'm going to be more loving today. Or I'm going to have more self-control. You could for a little bit of time, but eventually the true fruit will show up. So if God has not transformed that area of your life, the truth will come out, because you're going to produce the fruit of what's inside you, no matter how hard you try. And by the way, it's fruit, singular, right? Not fruits. Think about that. Right? And so to have these things in your life, it requires kind of this inside and outside thing, right? My wife was just telling me, if you exercise, you might kind of look better on the outside, but exercise can only take you so far. What else do you need to couple with exercise to really get fit? Diet. What's on the inside, right? Exercise may change what's going on or how you look on the outside, but there's this, you have to couple it with diet, which is a change of what's going on the inside. And so when Jesus is saying, look, it's the fruit of the Spirit, okay, or Paul, I guess, right? And not the fruit of effort. It's just reminding him, look, if you're a tree, Kate brought a watermelon, right? Okay, watermelon. My daughter really likes watermelons. That's irrelevant. That watermelon did nothing, or that watermelon vine did nothing to force that watermelon out, right? If you're a watermelon vine, you're not going to sit there and go, right? Sorry. I got flashbacks of when my children popped out, right? Okay. So the watermelon vine can't sit there. Through effort and determination, I am going to produce this watermelon. It can't do that, right? It produces the watermelon by being grounded in nutritious soil. That's it. And it just lets the nutrients of its environment and the sun and all these other factors that are out of its control seep into its system, and boop, out comes the watermelon. Okay, it's not that fast, obviously. Right? Okay? John chapter 15, verse 1. Too bad Johan's not here. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do what? Nothing. Think about, let that sink in. You can do nothing. You are completely helpless, me included, at producing the kind of fruit that really matters in God's kingdom. We can do nothing to produce the kind of fruit that reflects to the world who Jesus is. And so all he's saying is, look, the things you do in your devotional life, your involvement at church, the giftedness I give you, those are important. But don't forget that the one thing you are called to do is to abide. And the translation of that, 80s ghetto style, is to hang out. To just be with God. Just put yourself in a position where you are immersing yourselves in the presence of God. Because you know what? Self-improvement is not part of God's plan. Do you know that? Self-improvement is not part of God's plan. His plan is that your daily life completely depends on His strength. And whatever self-improvement that we think of flows out of that. Right? Because fruit grows only when the vine is rooted in nutritious soil. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, look, just like my kingdom is not about what's glamorous, just like my kingdom is not about worldly power, just like my kingdom is not about worldly wealth, he's saying, my kingdom is not about people doing stuff. Because you know who had the best devotional life? The Pharisees. And never once did Jesus compliment them. Right? He's saying, it's not about that. Let me just remind you, as I close this Sermon on the Mount, that my kingdom is about you being with me. And out of that flows everything else that needs to happen. And the reason why we should be reading the Bible and praying and things like that is to help us abide, is to help us hang out. Right? If you look at when Jesus first called the disciples, it never says he called the disciples so they should do stuff. It always says he called the disciples so they would be with him. And by spending that time rooted in God, that's when they're able to do what he's called them to do. Right? What's the main problem Jesus came to solve anyway? That broken relationship. Right? And so what's he saying here? Hey, just connect with me. That's your primary focus. And how you do that, whether that's devotional life or whatever, that's the thing is just connect with me. You come to church so you can connect with God. You go to community groups so you can connect with God. You read your word so you can connect with God. You listen to the sermon over and over again religiously so you can connect with God. Nobody does it. Okay? Why? Because when you abide in me, then you produce the fruit that shows the evidence of my work in your life. Let's close our eyes. No moody music today because we have potluck and I'm hungry. Just kidding. But I want us just to reflect on how we go about evaluating our Christian life. And what we think is the key to growth for us. Is it that next book? Is it that next experience? Is it that conference, that retreat? All those things are great, but all those things, again, are just reminding you that you have a Father in heaven that says, son and daughter, just spend time with me, and everything else will grow out of that. Not through your effort, but through you abiding in the nutritious soil of my Spirit.